Good morning, and welcome to Tuesday Tune-Up. Today, I will be discussing the scriptural stories that are common to each of the four Gospels. Some stories are only recorded by one Gospel writer. Some are recorded by two or three. But I found 32 stories that are reported by each of the four Gospel writers. Before we discuss the 32 Gospel stories, let's do a high-level review of the four Gospels. As each of you know, there are four Gospels: the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Luke, and the Gospel of John. The first three of these Gospels are known as the Synoptic Gospels. This is because the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are similar in structure, content, and wording. The oldest of these Gospels is Mark, and it was written about 30 years before the death of Christ. Mark is also the major source for the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. However, Matthew and Luke also use additional sources such as the mysterious Q. They were written about 20 or 30 years after the Gospel of Mark. The Synoptic Gospels are different from the Gospel of John. Not only were the Synoptics written from a few common sources, the Synoptics seem to be more focused on what Jesus did and said and what happened to Jesus throughout his life. In many ways, the writers of the Synoptic Gospels were like the reporters today. They focused on details, but these details are sometimes impacted by their different frames of reference, mostly due to the timing of the writing. For example, Mark was likely written before the fall of Jerusalem, which happened in about the year 70 of the Common Era, whereas both Matthew and Luke were written after the fall of Jerusalem. This was a huge event for the Jews at the time and for the early Christians. As I said earlier, the Gospel of John is quite different from the Synoptic Gospels. John wants us to know who Jesus is. In many ways, John was like an artist or a poet. The details of the story were not as important as the feeling and the overall impression of the story. The Gospel of John is the most recent of the Gospels and was likely written somewhere around the year 90 of the Common Era. Many think of John as a spiritual gospel, more theological than historical. However, recent studies show that John has a certain grounding in history. To be honest, John is where I get my best picture of Jesus. A great example of these differences can be found in their prologues. Mark's prologue introduces us to John the Baptist and starts by referring to a quote from Isaiah. In the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord." Mark clearly connects the ministry of John the Baptist with the prophecy of Isaiah. Matthew begins his gospel with, quote, "an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah," end quote, connecting Jesus with the lineage of both Abraham and David. Luke begins his gospel with a prologue describing how he created his orderly account of the life of Jesus. Then he quickly moves on to the birth of John the Baptist. The prologue of John's gospel is very different. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. This prologue is poetry. John paints a clear picture of Jesus as the Word. So what can we learn by reviewing the scriptural references that are common to all four Gospels? First, it may help us to better understand the most important parts of the life of Jesus. If all four Gospel writers each reported the same incident, it must have been important. Secondly, we may develop a deeper understanding of the Scripture by hearing it from four different frames of reference. So let's start by dividing the life of Jesus into 5 chapters. These chapters include the following: Jesus' birth and childhood. No scriptures from this chapter of Christ's life are common to all four Gospels. In fact, the Gospels of Mark and of John do not even mention the childhood of Jesus. The next chapter, the ministry of John the Baptist. Each of the four Gospels refer to the man we call John the Baptist. 3 of the stories referring to John the Baptist are described by each of the 4 Gospels. Jesus' ministry in Galilee. 9 scriptures are found to be recorded in common by all 4 Gospel writers, especially the ministry of Jesus. Obviously, the ministry of Jesus was important to them. The final week of Jerusalem. All 4 Gospels robustly report on the final week of Jesus in Jerusalem. A total of 19 scriptures are shared in common. And finally, the resurrection of Jesus. The Gospel of Mark only mentions the women at the tomb. Everything else we know of the resurrection comes from the other 3 Gospel writers. It is interesting that 2 of these chapters of Jesus' life include 1 or no scriptures in common. It is possible to conclude that these chapters are inconsequential. However, that conclusion would be dangerous. Let's start with the first chapter, Jesus' birth and childhood. For most children, the stories of Jesus' birth are their most memorable. And that probably goes for most of our society. Jesus is often seen as the most important, Christmas is often seen as the most important holiday of the Christian year. However, neither John nor Mark report at all on the childhood of Jesus. So yes, this may not be the most important part of Jesus' story. However, without the story of Jesus' birth, we would not celebrate Christmas. And if it wasn't for Christmas, many people would not know Jesus at all. How many people do you know who only attend church on Christmas? Likewise, the resurrection of Jesus has one story in common: the women at the tomb. So is this chapter of Jesus' life not important? Hardly. If not for the stories of the resurrection, there would be no Easter, and we would not be Christians, and you would not be watching this Tuesday tune-up. Well, this is a great place to stop. Next week, we will hear the story of Jesus' life told only through those scriptures which are common to all 4 Gospels. Until then, God bless each of you and have a great week. Goodbye.